And I'd like to extend my thanks to the Honourable Member for East London Derry for bringing this debate forward. Regarding transparency, and much has been said of it today, it's actually astonishing that the BBC got away with, and I use that term advisedly, got away with not publishing the highest paid salaries that it pays to its stars. But even, as we've heard, even the salaries that are published are not the full and true picture, as many of the salaries are paid via production companies. And it is quite understandable that the public see this as a deliberate way of avoiding full transparency, and it's simply not good enough. Some people indeed have said how suspicious it is that the BBC chose to publish these salaries at the point of a parliamentary recess in order to try again to avoid scrutiny and parliamentary questions being asked on the floor of the House. But surely the BBC, this liberal, trusted organisation, would not go to such lengths to avoid scrutiny. Surely this organisation can explain, and we're all waiting to hear, why it is that it pays its male stars significantly more than it pays its female stars. And some people would say that the BBC could well explain these matters. But I would contend, Mr Chair, that there is a public confidence crisis in the BBC. The problem is that the licence fee must be paid, and they must pay this regardless or not of whether they view the BBC at all. There is no opt-out. Now, that on its own should breed humility and a respect for the licence fee payer. But for too many people, instead, it has bred arrogance and complacency. The same arrogance and complacency, many would argue, that allowed Jimmy Savile to stalk the BBC corridors uninterrupted, despite numerous complaints and opportunities to stop this serial abuser. The BBC was found in a report which itself had commissioned that it actively shielded Savile, if not to say facilitated his abuse, and sadly was also guilty of pulling a report to be broadcast on Newsnight, even though the organisation knew all about his activities and the allegations against him. Journalist Marion Jones alleges that he and the late journalist Liz McKean were told they would, and I quote, "they would never work for the BBC again if they cooperated with a panorama investigation into the scandal, what the BBC knew into the panorama investigation, and lots of effort were made to block that panorama programme," he says. The BBC is an organisation that reports independently without fear or favour. But I ask you, in the light of what I've just said, does it really sound like it? And I have to say, Mr Chair, that many people in Scotland are of the view that the BBC is significantly partisan when it comes to its political coverage. Now, this has predictably and repeatedly been denied by the BBC, as you would expect, but it doesn't really matter whether that is true or not. What matters is that the people who pay the licence fee believe it to be true, and that means there is a problem. And it's a problem, a perception that even the head of BBC, the newly appointed director of BBC Scotland, Donalda McKinnon, has conceded that it is a perception that exists. But without any detailed plan being put forward about how trust can be rebuilt, I don't know what the way forward is for BBC Scotland's political coverage. There is no doubt there's a deficit of trust in the BBC. It's seen, I believe, across the United Kingdom as being resentful of public scrutiny, secretive, politically partial and complacent. And the trust that has been lost absolutely has to be rebuilt. And one way forward I would suggest today to the Minister is that if more of the licence fee money collected in Scotland could be spent in Scotland, indeed even Ofcom has said that this should be the case. If we could see an additional funding being spent on delivering quality TV and radio output in Scotland, supporting the growth of our creative industries, that would be a real step forward. Because for every £100 million of production in Scotland, around 1,500 jobs are supported and £60 million is generated in the Scottish economy. That's quite significant. The BBC really has a job of work to do to build trust with the people, and spending more of the licence fee collected in Scotland would be one way forward. The BBC has a lot of sins in its past and a lot of things it has to work through currently. But the future is not yet written. It can be different, it can be better, and the BBC can make it better. The BBC is a public service, and the public want a more transparent service. Thank you, Mr. Chair.